My name's Siobhan McLean. I'm a social worker registered in England. I've been a social worker for 30 years. I've been a practice educator for 27 years, although we used to be called practice teachers, then practice assessors, now practice educators. So I've been through all of those stages and I've been a member of NOPT for many years. And I'm going to be co-facilitating these 3 webinars that are going to go through January, February and March, looking at new ways of working in practice education. So that's me. Prospera, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hello, everyone. My name's Prospera Tedham. As Siobhan said, I'm logging on from Abu Dhabi, Al Ain to be specific, where I teach social work at the United Arab Emirates University. Prior to that, I've worked at the University of Northampton, the Open University and Anglia Ruskin. So I also hold the old PTA, the Practice Teaching Award. And I'm really interested in this whole idea of what we can learn from what's currently happening globally, and how we as practice educators might be able to not just learn but also implement what we're learning from the new set of circumstances into our work with students and other learners. Of particular interest to me is around how equality and diversity, anti-racist practice, how that should influence the way we work with students and people from all from different backgrounds within the context of practice learning. So I'll be joining you next month to deliver some of that. But for today, we'll be working with Siobhan to think about values and ethics as practice educators within this new context of not just COVID, but also People Remember and Black Lives Matter, and our push for a more kind of nuanced involvement from social work practice educators.
Okay, great. Thanks, Prospera. Jill, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Jill Yates and I am co-chair of the National Organisation of Practice Teaching, known as NOPT to most people. I am now a retired academic. My background was children and families, social work. I'm also, now that I'm retired from university, I do some independent work, some discrete pieces of work, mostly assessing student practice educators, being tutors for students, and the usual assessing ASYE, those kind of bits of work now. And it's quite nice to be able to choose what I do. We as NOPT have been keen to do something for practice educators, seeing as we didn't have our conference. So I'm hoping you're all going to enjoy today.
Thank you. Thanks, Jill. And Omar looks really busy, but do you want to introduce yourself, Omar, and tell people a little bit about the tech?
Yep, that's fine. So yeah, hi everyone, my name is Omar Mohammed. I'm a BA2 social work student at the University of Birmingham. And yeah, just a couple tech things from me. So your cameras and microphones are turned off.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you, Omar. So we'll make a start on the presentation. As Omar said, everybody will be sent the slides, but if there are some very particular issues of accessibility, we want to make sure that everyone is able to access, then if you email Omar, he will send them out to you now. But clearly they're going to be sent later, and it'll be easier if we can send them out to you along with your certificates. So, but this presentation that we're about to go through will be sent to everybody. We're just going to start off with a very brief introduction to NOPT for those people who don't know about NOPT. So I'm just going to hand over to Jill very quickly and she'll talk you through these slides. The National Organisation of Practice Teaching.
Okay, well, hello everybody again. And thank you for coming today. It's really good that so many of you are here. I just wanted to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the organisation. It's been going for quite a long time, I think about 40 years, and we have our own constitution, code of practice, and these have been updated this year because obviously over the years it needs to be updated with all the changes going on in social work and practice education. We are a committee at the moment of 11 members, and we are from all different parts of the country, and that's so that we get a national picture of what's happening to practice educators, students, practice education generally, and it gives us an idea of the differences between different areas and what's happening. We were a small committee for a while, as people who had been around for a long time left, and then last year we managed to get small committee members, so we're more strong now with 11 members. And our aim really is to promote good practice and maintain high standards in practice education, and but also to support practice educators and to perhaps have things for them. And if you're not a member already, it is free to join. And all you have to do is email admin at NOPT, and our administrator for NOPT will send you some information, and you will become a member. Could you change the slide? Thanks. So much of the work we do, apart from sort of coming together and talking about what's going on in different areas, we work with a lot of other organisations, and particularly BASWA, and we were contributed to the Professional Capabilities Framework Refresh and PEPS Refresh and the PCF review. Currently, we have people on the committee doing different things. The looking after your practice educators is something one of a couple of members of the committee are part of, and hopefully that's going to be something that will go out to organisations and to support you in your work. And QOPL is also being reviewed, so we're represented on there. I represent NOPT on the NICE Social Work Engagement Advisory Group, and they have lots of things on their website that are very useful for social workers, and I would recommend you look at those. We've got some on our website, but we'll be putting some more on. I've just received some more things to go on there. And we have a representative on the editorial board of the Journal of Practice Teaching, and we continue to link a lot with SCOT, which is the Scottish equivalent. They have a fantastic website, and we've been looking at perhaps sharing that with them at some point. Just to say, our website's been having some problems, and we're in the process of looking to change that, so hopefully that will be useful to members. We normally hold an annual conference and have done for years, and these have always been very successful. It's a good way, it's a good day out for practice educators to have the opportunity to learn from others and get new ideas, and a day perhaps away from work, away from students. And unfortunately, our conference was postponed last year for obvious reasons. But we've planned it again for this year, and the dates there, Tuesday 13th of July, Sheffield Hallam University. And if it's not going to happen face to face, we are going to attempt to set it up virtually. So that's something to look forward to. Next slide, please. So we felt that something was missing by not having the conference, and I know sometimes practice educators feel practice education sometimes doesn't get the credit it should, and we like to give you something for yourselves. And so we've managed to commission Siobhan to present these webinars for practice educators, and I know they'll be excellent. And with Prospera and Joe as well supporting, it's going to be some really interesting webinars, and I hope that you all enjoy them. And our thanks from NOT to all three of you for putting these on for us, and we just hope you have a good enjoy the webinars, and that they're productive and that you have some fun as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jill. And I know both Prospera and Joe and myself, we've all spoken at NOPT conferences, we've all attended NOPT conferences, we've all found value in NOPT conferences, so we've been really pleased to try and put something together that can help, since the conference needed to be cancelled, or let's say postponed rather than cancelled. And so the three of us will be working together, but what we decided was that each of us would take a lead in one of the sessions, with the other two being there to support. Joe's going to arrive slightly later, but you'll see a pop-up on screen later, and so perhaps Jo will introduce herself perhaps more clearly in the next session, but Joe's going to be here. So the session today is going to be looking at values and ethics with new ways of working. Prosper is going to be looking at anti-oppressive practice education within new ways of working, and Joe will be looking at how we can work with students where there are some issues and difficulties, and have those courageous conversations with students with these new ways of working. So that's what we're going to be doing, and we're really pleased to be working together as a team again. The last time actually that the three of us worked together very closely was when we developed Share as specifically a model for social work. We started off to develop Share, the three of us working together. What we found was whenever we used to speak together at conferences, we'd always be saying, oh, that we don't like that model, we don't like this model. And then we said, we've got to stop moaning about them and start develop one ourselves. So we did. And what we tried to do was, because all three of us are so involved in practice education, we tried to develop a model for practice educators that could be used both in our social work practice and in our practice with students. And so that's what we set about to develop. We worked on it and developed it with groups of students, newly qualified workers and practice educators over a year or two's period, and we wrote it up in 2018. And we've spoken about this quite a lot at different events, so we know lots of you probably know about Share. But just to start off, as a bit of an introduction to today's session, we hope today that there will be a shared learning experience. So we hope that there are going to be things for you to see today. There are things for you to hear today. There are things for you to do in today's session. And we'll be sending you out a list of resources after each of the sessions, which will guide you towards some further reading. And of course, we will ask you to evaluate how the sessions go. And so we will be modelling the model of Share. So you'll see that Share spells out seeing, hearing, action, reading and evaluation. And I imagine that Prosper is also going to talk through Share in terms of anti-oppressive practice education. So we'll probably refer a little bit to Share in each session. There are lots of tools. Share is a model, so we have lots of methods that you can use coming out of Share. And I wanted to just refer to these a little bit to say, as a practice educator, I've been a practice educator, as I said, for 27 years. I work with some students every year as a practice educator. And last year, when we went into the first lockdown, I was fortunate to work with 5 social work students on placement, and we were told at the start of their placement that it would be entirely virtual, that they would not leave. And I wanted to work with a number of students to see how is this going to work, so that I could bring that to my training and what I share with practice educators. Actually, they did all end up going out, some to more extent than others. They didn't just sit in their bedroom doing their placement, but it could have been like that, and we didn't really know. Now, I revisited Share and I used a number of these tools, and we will send both of these that you see on the photograph in front of you to you as part of the follow-up email from today. But one of the things that I've done for a long time as an off-site practice educator, for example, is I ask students to, well, I used to just give them the grid, the one that's at the back on the photograph there, that's just blank. And I'd say, handwrite this, to give them an idea that I didn't want them to write too much. Now, obviously, I'm working online. I do ask them to type it. But again, I just say, don't do too much. But I want them to just jot down anything they see during that week that they're interested in. So perhaps they observed something or they saw something that interested them. Anything they've heard that week, so perhaps a conversation or something they've spoken to a service user about. anything they've done, any action they've taken that they want to share with me, anything they've read, and then how are they evaluating how the placement is going. And what that's done for me as an off-site practice educator is it's given me an overview of the learning opportunities that the student has had, because I'm not there all the time to see what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. But what I've found is that practice educators who would have been what we would have called traditionally on site, in many ways we're now all off site because we're all working at home. So this has been a really good tool for people to use to capture what's the student actually doing and to really try and think through the opportunities that students can get. So this slide here, although it looks very busy, you'll have the slides later, so you'll be able to take a look at it in your own time. What you'll see written on this slide, not in the italics, we've used for years. Prospero, Joe and I have used this slide for a number of years now to help practice educators to think about the students' share on placement. So the top row is think about what the student sees on placement, making sure they get lots of opportunity to observe others, for example. Think about what they hear on placement. And I always used to say, before the pandemic, students would often say to me, I tell you what I hear a lot. I hear people saying, I don't know why you want to be a social worker. I wouldn't do it if I had my time over again. You know, we put the next generation off before they've even started. So we would always use this to think through what is the student seeing and hearing and doing and reading, and how are they evaluating it. But when I started to work with these students in lockdown, the 5 students that I've never physically met, but I worked as practice educator for, the italics underneath is what I put my thoughts about how do I do this in this new world. So in terms of seeing, clearly we have to think about safety in terms of traditional shadowing opportunities. You know, some practice educators are saying to me, oh, I'm still taking students off out with me to see things. Well, that's okay, but what about the risk that that's posing to those service users that you're going to see? Maybe, you know, students can still observe, but they can observe via Teams or via Skype or whatever system it is that you're using in your local authority. Think about buddying students up. So where traditionally they would be sitting in a team room and they'd overhear things and they'd learn from that. How about, you know, the students I worked with, we tried to buddy them up so that each morning they'd spend 10 or 15 minutes just talking to a member of the team, a different member of the team every day, to help them feel connected. So I'm not going to go through the whole of this slide. It will be sent out to you and you'll get to have a look at it. The grid underneath is the practice educators share. So what does the what do I see of the student? So that's all about direct observations. What do I hear? Feedback about the student. What do I do to support the student? What about when I read the student's work, and so on. So we've got the full share here. And I know because of a few emails we've had before the sessions that some of you have said, you know, what I really want to get from the session is knowing how to develop an induction pack in new ways of working, or how to provide supervision in new ways of working. But I have done some webinars on that already, and they are available for you to watch back on YouTube. Omar's going to put into the chat either now or in a little while a link to, I've done a specific webinar, well, a couple of them, but a specific webinar on providing learning opportunities for students. I've done a specific webinar on supervision and another one on assessment in this new way of working. So we didn't want to repeat in these sessions what we'd already done. So today's session is going to look specifically at values and ethics, but in relation to each of those areas, in relation to how do we teach students, how do we assess students. But if you do want more specific information on how do I do an induction pack, for example, we've got that additional information for you there, and Omar will pop it into the chat. But the reason for doing these particular webinars is all about this impact of COVID. As Prospero has said, you know, not just in the UK, but around the world, the impact of COVID. And the things that I've noticed are rapidly changing policy and practice. You know, just the rules that we have in society are changing on a daily basis, not just our rules in social work. But that makes it difficult for all social workers, but all the more difficult for students who are just trying to get hold of something and it changes straight away. There's an increased isolation of the people that we seek to support as social workers, but also for ourselves as social workers. The two illustrations on the slide in front of you are supposed to demonstrate what students tell me. Students are experiencing either extreme isolation, working from home, totally on their own. It doesn't have to be as neat and tidy, your bookcase, as that background, but totally on your own. Or they're talking about trying to manage homeschooling and children and keep everybody safe at the same time as trying to learn about a profession, at the same time as trying to do a placement, just juggling everything all at once. And that also applies not just to students, but also to us as practice educators. I spent 3 months of last year completely on my own, at home, didn't see a soul. The only connection I had was on something like this, on Zoom. And I know how much that impacts. So there's an increased isolation. There's a lack of situated learning opportunities. That opportunity for students to sit in a busy office and overhear a telephone call and think, oh, I really like the way they did that, I'll do that. Or just overhearing conversations, that's gone. Even if students are going into offices, it's in small bubbles, it's not as busy, they're not overhearing stuff because they're not right next to people anymore. So that situated learning has been impacted. That also means that for you and for students, there's a lack of situated support. You know, you have a very difficult telephone call at work. If you're in an office, the person next to you will say, oh, that was a hard call. Can I make you a cup of tea? If you're doing that at home in your bedroom, you've no situated support around you. There's a lack of what we call transitional opportunities, and I'm going to explore that a little bit later, so I won't talk in detail about that now. We're bringing social work into our own homes and potentially into our families. That leads to the potential for moral injury, which again, I'm going to talk about later in today's session. People are also trying to homeschool at the same time. I know Prospera's homeschooling at the moment. You know, we're all trying to do that at the same time. You need to think about, where is your working space? Where is your reflective space? I mean, practice educators have been talking to me about head space and brain space and saying to me, I've just not got the brain space to work with a student at the moment. This is all about space. What are we going to do about space at the moment? And there are general boundaries issues. So all of these things have had a really significant impact on social work and on practice education. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But as I've said to you, if you want information and guidance on specific issues about learning environments, or how to do a direct observation online, then there's another series of webinars that you can sit and watch back at your own leisure that cover those things. So today will be very specifically about values and ethics. But I'm going to relate those values and ethics that we explore today into the practice educator professional standards. Now, I know these are England specific, and we've been joined by practice educators from Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland, but it still gives an overview of what we're doing as social workers, because we're going to look at learning environments in COVID and the values and ethics issues. We're going to look at teaching and facilitating learning in COVID and the values and ethics issues. We're going to look at assessment and the values and ethics, and our own CPD and values and ethics. All about ethics, but related into those 4 areas. Now, the PEPs says in, I think, section 1.2 of the new PEPs, if we want to be exact, says that at the heart of the document is a set of values. So we're going to look at what is that set of values. I'm not going to read it out to you, and just wanted to make sure that that values statement within the practice educator professional standards is included in the slides, because they're coming out to you as a resource. But we're looking at things like, We need to ensure that consideration is given to the needs and interests of people with lived experience of social work when we're assessing the capability and the skills of students. Well, there's a challenge to how do we get feedback from people in these new ways of working? When we're not physically meeting people, how might we be able to do that? There are also challenges about how we just think about learning, think about assessment. So managing personal and professional boundaries and our use of authority and power within the assessment relationship. One of the key things that's changed during COVID worldwide is boundaries have become much more fluid, because we're coming into people's homes now, literally online. So we really need to think about the way in which COVID has impacted on all of these values. Now, the actual values statement sits at 2.1. So I don't know if you've spotted anything there. I'm not going to read through the whole of this because it's there, as I say, as a resource for you, but it's what I've considered in planning today's webinar. But I said section 1.2 says that it's really important, and section 1.2 of the PEPs actually refers to BASWA's Code of Ethics for Social Work, which it says in the PEPs was revised in 2014, but I need you to recognise that actually there have been 2 updates since COVID. The latest update is November 2020. So what that shows is, although it was revised in 2014 and it sat there for 6 years, it actually had 2 revisions last year. Now that shows how much our values and ethics are being challenged and changed in contemporary ways of working. So, but section 1.2 of the PEPs says BASWA's Code of Ethics incorporates statements of principles drawn up by the International Federation of Social Workers and the International Association of Schools of Social Work. And this code should underlie all social work practice. So the PEPs refers us to that. Section 1.2, section 2.1. Notice anything about that? 2.1, 1.2, it's all about 2021. It's the 2.1, 21. So I'm going to try to bring to life in this webinar something about values and ethics for practice education in 2021. And I want us to think about this very much around the contemporary world. So domain A of the Practice Educator Professional Standards. It's all about learning environments. And behind this image are 2 photographs that students have sent to me of their experience of placement in 2021. Both of these photographs are totally anonymous. You can't tell where they're from at all. And these photos show what a contemporary learning environment looks like. So this is a student induction pack in the year 2021. Now, 18 months, 2 years ago, would you have ever said that's what a student induction pack is going to look like? A laptop, a mobile phone, a packet of gloves, a packet of face masks, and some alcohol gel. That's the student induction pack of 2021. That's what a student was given. They went to have a meeting with their practice educator and came back with that. That same student was told it's really important that you work from home 2 days a week, but you must come into the office 3 days a week. That's very important to us. You're going to be part of a bubble. We're going to keep you safe. It'll be COVID secure, but you must come into the office 3 days a week because that's how you're going to learn. And after the first 2 days, the student sent me this photograph and said, this has been the whole 2 days that I've been here. I've been asked to be in the office and the office has not looked any different to this in those whole 2 days. She was the only person in the office for those 3 days. We've got to think about the learning environment. It's not about space and place. It's not about where you are. It's about the relationships that are created for you through that placement. That's what a learning environment is like. You can learn from home, but connected with relationships. You're much more likely to learn at home with a connection of virtual relationships and speaking to people via Teams or Skype or whatever system you use than you are sitting in an empty office. So don't feel that the student has to be in the office. It's not that bit that is essential. My own daughter, she's not a social worker, but she's doing a year in industry at the moment, and she's been asked to go into the office as well. And she said to me, every day I go into the office, I'm the only person there. So that's, you know, don't ask someone to come into the office if they are going to be the only person there. It's not essential. The where isn't the essential aspect of a learning environment. It's the who, it's the relationships, it's the what are you doing, it's the why are you doing it. It's not the where you're doing it that matters. So just to kind of remind you of that. In terms of helping students to learn, so domain B, how do we help students to learn? How do we teach students when we're maybe not physically together in supervision anymore? Maybe supervision is taking place on a screen like this, so you're perhaps doing it via Teams or something. That can be tricky. So I want to share with you now an activity that I'm going to ask you to do. I said there are going to be things for you to see and hear and action for you to take. So in a short while, I'm going to go through 3 or 4 slides with you now, and I'm going to ask you then to take 10 minutes away from the screen and actually do an activity during the webinar. And this is based on understanding of thinking styles. Now, I know that very often in practice educator training, we talk a lot about learning styles. You know, we talk about the activist, the pragmatist, the reflector, and we put that into Share. We talked about learning styles within Share, but we also critiqued it a little bit in Share, because it is actually, it's been around a long time. It doesn't necessarily work for everybody. In some ways, I think it's a bit pseudoscience. It doesn't always work. Now, I still refer to that. I still think about what learning style does the student I'm working with have. But more important to me is, what is this student's thinking style? And that comes from the work of Temple Grandin. Temple Grandin is an American scientist. She's actually an animal behaviorist scientist. That's what she's well known for. But Temple Grandin has autism, and she writes quite widely about neurodivergence in terms of our thought processes. And I found this fascinating. She writes about how some people are verbal thinkers. They think in words. Some people are visual or picture-based thinkers. They think in images and analogies. And some people are mathematical or musical thinkers. Doesn't mean that you're a good singer or you're any good at maths. It's more about patterns, the patterns of our thoughts. It's like thinking in patterns and logic. The 2 most common thinking styles are verbal thinkers and picture-based thinkers. And for very personal reasons, I got fascinated in this about 7 years ago, and I used it in my practice education, and I found it's been transformational in the way that I work with students. So I wanted to bring this into today's webinar. I had a stroke 7 years ago. It was quite a major stroke. I lost the use of the right-hand side of my body. I lost the ability to verbally communicate. I lost the ability to read and write. I was in stroke services for, was an inpatient for several months, and I relearned a lot of those skills. And as a result of that, I've become fascinated as part of the recovery process by learning about the different sides of our brain and how our brain functions and what we learn from it. Because I've got several MRI scans of my brain, and I have them done fairly regularly, and so I can see where there are white spots on my brain. It means those parts of my brain died during the stroke, but other parts of my brain have been able to compensate for that. So I relearned to do things by using other parts of my brain. I have always been a picture-based thinker. Thankfully, the white spots on the brain scans are in the verbal side of my thinking. So the picture-based side has been able to compensate. it's helped me to learn such a lot about this different thinking sides of our brain, and trying to use whole brain activities in social work learning. And for me, this is really, really important, something that we really need to do as practice educators all of the time, but more so now because of the limitations of pandemic practice placements. So there's some research up on the screen there that shows not just something that I've decided to come up with. There's research about this. You know, we know that visual thinking is more prevalent than we previously thought. We know that visual thinking is particularly helpful for developing analytical skills, for developing decision making, for reflection. And so in social work, unfortunately, you can't go to a judge and have a picture coloured in and say, here's my report. You know, you can't go to a fostering panel with, here's a picture that I've bought for you for my report. We can't submit a picture at the end of a placement and say, here's the report on the student, I've done it in pictures. We can't do that. Everything's very verbal in social work. But what that means is that if you're a picture-based thinker, sometimes you don't always reflect in that way, and it may not help your thinking. And especially at the moment, when you are really, our sensory abilities are limited, we're not able to. There's lots of you in the audience. If we were together at a NOPT conference face to face, I'd be able to pick up what's going on in the room. Are people enjoying this? What's the atmosphere like? Do I need to lift it? Because I could draw on the senses. But I don't have any of that. I'm just sitting in a bedroom talking at a computer screen. So we've lost a lot of that visual and that sensory ability. So trying to reintroduce this for students is really important. So I'm going to ask you to do a visual thinking activity now, rather than just sitting looking at a screen. In a moment, we're going to take 10 minutes, just 10 minutes away from the screen, just to break up the 2-hour session as well. I'm going to ask you to take 10 minutes away from the computer. And what I want you to do is find an object. If you're at home, find an object in your house. If you're at the office, you can find an object in the office. Go and make yourself a cup of tea. And while you're on the way to make a quick cup of tea, find an object. And then that object needs to represent social work values and ethics, or maybe practice education values and ethics. And come back to the screen prepared to tell us why. If you can, bring the object back with you. I mean, obviously, if your object is the wardrobe, don't drag that to the computer. It's okay. You can just tell us it's the wardrobe. In the chat, you can tell us what object you've got and why you chose it. But we'd like a couple of people to be brave enough to pop up on camera and show us your object and tell us about it. So stick your, as Omar said, stick your electronic hand up. Omar will switch the cameras on and you can share your object. I think maybe Prosper is going to share an object with us as well. But I'm going to give you not very long, just 5-10 minutes at most to nip away from the screen now and go and find yourself an object. And I've also noticed that Joe's popped up. I think it looks like you're in the office, Joe. I don't know, but hi, Joe. Great to see you. So off you go. You got 5 minutes to go and find an object, do a bit of a scavenger hunt around your house, and then come back and share that object. So while people are finding their objects, I'll just sit and have a quick look at the chat and what's been going on in the chat and see if anybody introduces their object in the chat. Oh, Omar, I've noticed somebody said in the chat the slides aren't tying in with what's being said, but then I think someone's then said it's just you, so maybe it's just that screen. Okay.
yeah, sometimes it's due to, you know, the bandwidth, you know, others using the internet at home, especially with homeschooling, you know, and things like that. But what I've done is anyone that has been messaging with that problem, I've just been saying email me, and I'll email you back the slides, so they can just follow the slides with whatever device they have, and then also listen to you and the other presenters.
Okay, lovely. Okay. I can't see if anybody's put their hand up. I don't know if anybody's put their hand up, Omar, with an object, because you could.
We've got 2 people with their hands up now. Now we've got 4.
Okay, we've got a few going up now. So if we just wait a moment or two, and then we don't have very long actually, because that bit's taken longer than I thought it would. So because when you design something that you've never done before, you don't know what the timings are going to be, do you? So but we'll maybe just take 2 people, if that's okay, Omar.
Yeah, that's fine.
In terms of time. So okay. Are there many questions as well? I'll have a look in the Q&A. So
we've got 2 questions. You want me to read them to you now?
I can have a quick. I've just clicked on, so I've managed to find.
Awesome.
I've some tips on completing observations online. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'll direct them. And Sarah, share model and assist. Okay. Okay, lovely. Right, I'll try and give that a go.
Thanks.
Okay, so you can't tell if everybody's back, can you, from their scavenger hunt and their cup of tea? But we've had 5 minutes, so I think, and we've got 11 people with their hands raised. So Omar, if you want to just try and select a couple of people to promote up, that'll take a moment or two, and then when they arrive, they can share their objects. And while we're doing that, perhaps I can ask Prospera to share her object whilst Omar's choosing people. So Prospera, what object have you got?
Okay, so mine's quite interesting, only because I thought about it just as you asked me at the start, Siobhan. I've got a bottle of water here. And I think for me, the significance of water is obviously the fact that we all need water to survive. Okay, water has its many functions in terms of keeping us healthy, keeping us hydrated, etc., etc. And the doctors always kind of caution and remind us of the importance of water. And I feel that, you know, without social work without values and ethics, we wouldn't have a profession anyway. That's kind of where I'm coming from it. And so I see values and ethics as being the water, if you like, of the profession, in that we need it ourselves, but we also need to keep reminding our students to take their swigs and their doses of water during the day, keep them safe, keep them healthy, and for everyone actually in the world, regardless of where they are, water kind of means the same thing. You know, water's used for the same thing around the world. So in that regard, and looking at social work as a global profession, we can say that, you know, water is important everywhere, therefore values and ethics and social work are important everywhere as well. And my kind of takeout from today is really that if we ourselves are good at drinking our water and hydrating ourselves, then clearly it will be on the list of things to kind of suggest to our students to do. You know, hydrate yourself, keep hydrated, keep your values. Don't get people second guessing where you're coming from on this. You know, the second guessing can be good, but actually as a student, I would want you to be more open and outward about the values that you hold as a social work student, and therefore take that into qualified practice.
I love that. Thanks, Prospera. But later on, people will not be convinced that you've not seen these slides before today, have you? Because later on, we're going to talk about water and ethics.
No way.
You didn't know that. So it's amazing. It's just really, and people will be, oh, they must have known.
No, I'm seeing these slides for the first time, everyone. Honest.
So that's good. That's going to be really good. It's going to tie in. I could have paid you to do that, Prosper, because it's going to tie it in. So that's great. And it looks like Omar has brought a couple of people in to join us. So Martin, I can see you, Martin. Do you want to put your microphone on and tell us what your object is and why you chose it?
Hi, Siobhan. Hi, everybody. I can't take credit for this. I just walked into the living room and said, I've got to find an object. And my partner said, well, what about scales? Which I thought, so it's not my idea, but I've come up with kitchen scales or bathroom scales because it's the balance of your social work values and ethics versus your personal ones. You know, we all know that professional and personal values do not always sit comfortably together. And I think that's one of the things I always try with students, to communicate that it's okay to have different personal values to your professional ones. It's about how you apply them and how you compartmentalize and put those negative personal values aside and concentrate on your professional values. So it's all about balancing the two, I think. That's kind of what I was thinking. So it's not my suggestion, but as soon as he said scales, I thought, oh yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Love that analogy. You've got to thank your partner for that.
I have, don't worry.
Thanks for that, Martin. Jennifer, I can see you've popped in as well. Do you want to unmute yourself, put yourself so we can hear you and tell us what you've bought?
Hi, yeah, I don't know whether you can see or not. I've got a sculpture. It's a sculpture my dad brought me back from Canada many years ago, and I don't know if you can see, it's like a balance of three people with a person being supported on top. And I think for me, that really underpins everything we try and do within social work. Not only do I work within a great team that support each other, we've actually got students there at the moment. So, you know, we have a network that without that support for our students, they're not going to achieve and reach their goal at the top. So that underpins the values immensely for me in terms of actually it's that root of what you've got within a team that you reach out for at the moment.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. You could take it further as well, couldn't you, as well, Jennifer?
Yeah,
because it's a piece of artwork. So
absolutely.
Social work.
Absolutely. It just underpins, you know, the support that we give. Just without that baseline of support, you're never going to reach that top goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for that, Jennifer, and thanks for putting your hand up and joining us.
Thank
you.
I'm
sorry that we could only have a couple of people, but we're so tight for time. But please do put in the chat what your object was and tell us why. Why did it represent social work values and ethics for you? What I'd say is I found this has been a great activity to do with students when I'm working with them virtually. So I've been asking students to bring an object that represents all kinds of different things. So each session they'll bring something, and somebody bought when it was talking about how are you feeling, and somebody bought a soggy tea bag, and we had a really good conversation about why they felt like this soggy tea bag. And it's a really interesting way of, well, it builds on what we know in social work about third object theory, you know, based on direct work with children and how you use a third object to be able to encourage conversation. And I think to get some reflective emotional conversation, it's really good to use objects, and you can then refer back to it, can't you? So you could refer back to, do you remember when we talked about the scales and how you get the balance? You can refer back to, do you remember the statue? And it's really helpful to use this as an activity, and works really well. I mean, I've always used similar type activities, but I've extended it for working in the pandemic, and I've found it works really well. So we wanted to get you to do an activity today, and hopefully it wasn't too much of a panic when you ran out going, I've got to find an object into the kitchen, and maybe you had the supportive partner as well, so like we heard about. But we're going to move on now to looking at just some of the specific values and ethics issues. So I've tried to look with you at domains A and domains B, but in terms of helping students to learn, you know, there's been a lot around values and ethics, and I think there've been a lot of very significant learning opportunities. I have noticed myself in the students that I've worked with, both as a practice educator and the many students that I'm engaging with around training, I've noticed more critical thinking from students and a keen sense of the importance of values in practice. There's been lots of issues around the Black Lives Matter movement. Crisis, we know, always exaggerates inequality. So we've been able to really explore the inequality and how that's coming about. There's international work on ethical dilemmas created in the pandemic, which I'm going to refer to. And there's also been a lot of specific COVID related resources. So the Social Work in 2020 COVID-19 magazine was brilliant. They call it a magazine because it was done so quickly, and rather than it being a journal, it didn't go through those processes. But all of the articles were peer reviewed. They're really good articles, and I'd get students to go and take a look at that, and you take a look at those if you've not seen it. So it's held at Sheffield University, but I'm sure I saw Abid's name earlier in the audience, and Abid, it was one of the, and I can see Joe nodding, Abid was one of the editors there, so he'll be able to tell you a bit more about it as well. But I think it's a great resource, and particularly a lot of things around values and ethics. I would just want to refer you, just while we're talking about learning, theory. Theory is always important for us to think about, isn't it, when we're teaching and learning with students? But right back, let's go right back to Kaplan. No, in the 1960s, he wrote about crisis. And I think re-looking at crisis intervention theory with students at the moment is so helpful, you know. I mean, Kaplan's original work has been rewritten and revised since then, but still they talk, most people who write about crisis will still talk about three stages: the impact, the recoil, and then the reorganization or reimagining or adjusting, whatever they call the third stage. Now, I think if I explore my own response to the pandemic, it follows these three stages. You know, I know the initial impact on me actually happened for me on World Social Work Day last year. I set off in my car, all loaded up for the week. I was going to events all through the week. I did the first event Monday in Preston. And that day I was getting calls all day. Everything was cancelled. Everything was cancelled. I came home and I went into shielding. So that was my, you know, on World Social Work Day. And I did go into, how am I ever going to be able to do this? I'm never going to be able to do practice education. I'm never going to be able to do relational training. And yet, you know, I've readjusted and I've reimagined what I do. And I think some elements of things are working really well, and I would want to take forward from this. So, you know, looking at that crisis intervention, I think is helpful. So I just wanted to remind us of the theory and how the theory might relate. But we're all about values and ethics today. You know, I've said we've got these other webinars that we can direct you to on the specifics, but today is all about values and ethics. And in terms of domain C, how do we assess students? I think the biggest issue, and certainly the thing that worried me the most when I was working with students last year, is how do we do a direct observation? It's really a challenge. You know, if the student is going out to do face-to-face work and do home visits, I think we have to really ask the question, should we go with them? Because we're then increasing the risk again to service users of someone else coming into their home who might be bringing the virus. So there's so many ethical issues about how do we do direct observations. And I know I was really worried about this going into working with the students. And all I would say for you is, if you've not worked with a student yet in this way, I was the most worried about this. And actually, it was the least concerning thing on placement and the thing that went most straightforward. Actually, it wasn't a big deal in the end. So I've gone back in much the same way, go back to look at crisis intervention theory. Sometimes when we're in crisis, it's always good to go back to something you know and something that works. So I went back to the University of York's model of direct observation, which is old now, it's from 2000, but it's a great model of direct observation. And ironically, I remember being introduced to this via NOPT. NOPT conference. This is where I kind of learn about the reflective collaborative model of direct observation. And it's a three-stage model. If you're not familiar with it, go back and revisit it, because it worked really well to just slow my thinking down. because the routinized ways of working that we've had have been challenged by this, and going back to a model that slows you down, a 3-stage model of direct observation. So reflecting for action, thinking about how are we going to do the observation, and starting from scratch. So in the past, I've always had ideas in my head about how will the observation go, you know, or I'll do a home visit with you and we'll travel together and we'll do it like this. And actually just thinking about what work are you doing? How can I observe that? And I've done observations on Teams video. I've done a Skype call. I've done a WhatsApp joint call. I've done where the student went out to the home of the service user a couple of times and took their phone and videoed it, and I was at the other end of the phone. I've done a whole range of different things, and all of them worked actually really well. I didn't need to be as worried as I was about them. But revisiting facts, feelings and feedback, the model from the University of York, was very helpful for me. And there is more on that in the webinars that we're directing you to about how to do assessments during the pandemic. There's a lot more detail on how I've used that. There are some students and newly qualified workers in those webinars talking about how the observations went from their perspective. So I'm not going to spend lots of time on the practicalities of that, but I am going to just raise there are some ethical issues about this. And if a session is recorded, what happens to that? And are we being clear with the service user about what happens to that? I remember a project by Skills for Care, I think it must have been 5 or 6 years ago, where they were talking about doing direct observations and having those direct observations videoed so that a third person could watch it and see if they agreed with the practice educator's observation conclusions, almost as a kind of sampling process. And I remember there was an outcry in the profession about you can't video what's going on in people's homes. There was a real outcry about it. And it made me think about that and the way in which we basically, as a profession, we wouldn't go along with that project, and it just didn't take off. And I think we've been thrown into this so quickly. We need to just have a bit of slowed down thinking about it. And how do we address the ethics of going into people's homes with our video conferencing, for example? You know, service users have got my telephone number now because I've done a WhatsApp joint call with a service user, a social work student and me. They made a WhatsApp group for us to do that in. So they have my phone number, don't they? And I'd not really thought that through beforehand. Now, they've not tried to contact me and it's not been an issue, but it could be an issue. So I've spent more time thinking about that now. You know, what are the ethical issues about the use of particular technology? We know, you know, Amanda Taylor, we know very well, has done a lot of work about ethics in social work and tech. And so looking at that is going to be helpful, especially if you're doing your PEPS qualification. You might want to look at some of the research that Amanda Taylor's done. So just looking at some of that, I think is important. Now I'm raising this as questions and I'm not necessarily giving you answers at this point, although I want to go on to looking at values and ethics in terms of our own CPD. Domain D of the PEPS is our own CPD. How do we keep ourselves up to date? That's what Domain D is all about. And I want to go through the things that I've learned, my own CPD as a result, in terms of values and ethics as a result of COVID. And that's where I want the main focus of the webinar to be. And it might give some answers to those questions about the ethics of virtual assessment, for example. What I'd say in terms of CPD, though, is there are lots of new opportunities since the impact of COVID. So, for example, I've been doing a series of webinars on a Wednesday night that Omar's been involved with. He's been involved in the first 26, and that's why we work together now, and he's doing the tech today. But we they've been every Wednesday night. Prosper has spoken at some of those. Joe's spoken at one of those. And we're joined by between 300 and 1,000 people at those webinars every Wednesday night. Now, mostly it's students that join, but they're really relevant for practice educators, and any of you can join those webinars. They're free. They're like this. They're just an hour long. There's no, you know, your video's not on. You could be eating your tea while you're watching it. Doesn't matter. Omar's going to put the link into the chat now if you want to register for the next one of those, which is next Wednesday night. And then we go from there every Wednesday night. Now, next Wednesday is a general one. We're calling it Back to the Future, and we're going to introduce some new team members and do some other things. But the Wednesday after that, for example, we're looking at men in social work and why do men students face particular barriers. And it's really interesting for practice educators, that session. So you can join any of those, and, you know, they're now available. They were never available before. YouTube. I remember my daughter, when she's doing engineering, but when she was doing her A-levels, she used to watch so many educational YouTube videos. And I thought to myself, well, what have we got in social work? And there was very little. It was all very American. But since the pandemic, there are loads of YouTube channels now on social work in the UK. So I'm not sure if Shabnam is in the audience today. I don't know if I'm seeing Prosper and Joe nodding, but I've got to tell you, School of Shabs on YouTube, if you've not watched it, watch it. You know, Shabnam is talking about practice education. She gives loads of ideas on YouTube for supervision. I've set up a YouTube channel with lots of videos on there for practice educators and students. There's a social work student set up, Diana has a YouTube channel, Omar, doesn't she? You can probably put the link into the chat. There's Kaylee Rose Evans, who is a social worker who's set up doing some videos on YouTube about being a newly qualified social worker. She did something recently about writing essays. Your students might find that helpful. So there's been a growth of stuff that wasn't there before. So in terms of our CPD, there's lots of new things available. And also just the challenges of new ways of working are also extending our CPD. I've learned a lot from the challenges, you know. So I do think our own CPD has been significantly enhanced. The thing I've learned about, and I am really in some ways very pleased I've learned about, in other ways I wished I'd never needed to learn about it, but is moral injury. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the impact of moral injury, which to me was just not really something I'd even thought about or learnt about before the pandemic. And this is where it links into water. The water image is going to come up a few times. And honestly, Prospera has not seen these slides, so she didn't know we were going to talk about water. But I'm going to talk about the impact of the pandemic on all of us. And this is a quote taken from an American psychologist who does a lot of work with American social workers. And it's never been more relevant than now. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss on a daily basis and not be touched by it is about as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And this for me has been a go back to phrase throughout this pandemic and the work that we're doing, and even our personal lives and the impact of this pandemic on our personal lives. And this is something that I want to explore with you now. And I want you to think about yourselves. I want you to think about the students that you work with as well. And it might be difficult for us to think about this, but we do need to go there and then explore how it feels for us. There has been a huge impact on social workers working from home. We know, don't we, that trauma and space are connected together. We know that, you know, trauma-informed practice tells us that. I want you to feel that as I'm talking now, you can use the chat, and Joe and Prospera are going to be there in the chat with you to support you with anything around this. But trauma and space are connected. And, you know, society knows that. I mean, social workers, we know that, but society knows that. Phrases like, do you remember where you were when you heard about such and such a thing? Social work is in our homes. It's coming into our families. How do we avoid secondary trauma of social work impacting on our families? The limitations we talked about earlier in terms of situated learning, in terms of situated support. What happens if you get a really difficult telephone call? I know that students and new workers need to learn how to not take that personally if somebody's having a go at you on the phone and being aggressive. If you're doing that in your bedroom, how on earth are you supposed to learn not to take it personally when you're in a personal space? It's difficult. It's really tough. And I believe that our employers and our educators, and I include myself in that as a practice educator, we have a responsibility to support one another in creating reflective and emotionally safe working spaces. Now, throughout the pandemic, at the beginning, you remember I told you on World Social Work Day, the impact of coronavirus, training was cancelled. You know, my regular job was totally cancelled for several months. Nobody was even thinking about how can we provide training at the beginning. And so I was kind of a bit like recoil, what can I do? How do I do it? And I'm a visiting professor at the University of Chester, and I worked with colleagues there. And we started to offer reflective support to social workers in, you know, working in really difficult circumstances. And I developed models for doing that. And I'm still doing that now. I've committed myself to providing at least 3 reflective sessions for social workers and students who are struggling during the pandemic. And I'm going to share with you now some of the things that they've said. Some are funny and have made me think, and some are really difficult. But these are some of the things, some of the statements that stay with me from those sessions about the impact of working from home. There was a hospice social worker who said to me, here I am doing death and dying at my kitchen table. And that's a challenge, you know. I'm doing what I can, but it's never going to be enough. I keep on asking myself, how am I ever going to get over all of this? Students saying to me, how am I supposed to learn about my profession sitting in my bedroom in a global pandemic? Just watching it online isn't enough. A newly qualified social worker, when I said to her, you know, he's the really tall guy. And she said, well, I don't know how tall they are. I've only ever seen them on screen. You know, that struck me about how we're not developing those relationships that we need. A social worker who said to me, I'm haunted by what I did. They were married for 72 years and they never saw each other again. And that was when somebody supported a move into residential care. Living with that, I'm haunted by that. It's loss after loss. How are you supposed to process it all? It feels like a war zone and we just have to keep on battling. I feel like my home's been invaded. And I feel like when this is all over, I'm never going to want to come in this room again. I feel abandoned by social work leadership. A hospital social worker who said, I was allocated 20 new cases for urgent discharge. The end of that day, I closed 17 because they died. Hearing this, it's like being in a horror story, and people saying at the start of this, I felt helpless, and now I just feel hopeless. I've lost hope. Our values and ethics are being challenged. What can we do about that? And I remember thinking at the beginning of this whole pandemic, where online I was hearing students saying my placement's been cancelled and I don't know what to do. And my heart was going out to every single person, and I was feeling, what can I do? What can I do? And the social worker in us goes back to our values, back to our ethics, back to what keeps us, back to that statue of supporting one another and what keeps us together in structure. And all I could offer was reflection. But I can't tell you how much people say reflection's helped. I'm amazed, but it's helped. I did a session on just this week, and if I'm going to be entirely honest with you now, I know there's nobody here who was in that session. Well, I hope there's not, but I came out of that session and I sat in the kitchen and I had a little cry. It was a really tough session, listening to people's trauma. And I was thinking, what have I been able to do? I've not been able to do anything there. And I sent the notes of the session out, and a couple of people have emailed me back and said, thank you so much for that. Someone else has said, I just felt a weight lifted off my shoulders, and reflection helps. All we can do at the moment is reflection, is conversations. But we need to acknowledge moral injury and what is going on with moral injury and what that means and how it's challenging our values and ethics. And all of those quotes on there are examples of moral injury. So it's originally a concept that's taken from the military that I'd kind of vaguely heard of before the lockdown, but there's a poll that's just come up. It depends what system you're watching this on, but you can vote in the poll on most systems. And the question that's come up is, are you familiar with the concept of moral injury? And you've been asked yes, no, or not sure. Now, I know people who've attended sessions with me before will be familiar with the concept of moral injury because I'm talking about it all the time. But I can see here that so far we've had 180 people and they're still voting. 58% of people have never heard of the concept of moral injury. And I wanted to introduce this in today's webinar because it's very important for us as practice educators to think about moral injury. It's used in the military, where it's used to refer to the psychological distress that is resulting in the cause of which is about either being asked to do something that violates your moral code or not being able to do something and that violating your moral code. And the poll's finished now. And we can share the results here, but 27% of you are familiar with moral injury, but 56 are not, and 17% are not sure. So just shows that this is something that really isn't necessarily something that we've heard of in social work, but is a concept that's really important. It was first developed by Jonathan Shea more than 20 years ago. Working with Vietnam veterans. It's used a lot in American social work, but that's because they have a lot of social work in the military. So there's very little about it in terms of social work. But at the start of the pandemic, in the British Medical Journal, the equivalent of a group of practice educators of social workers, so a group of practice educators of medics, wrote an article where they speculated that they thought medics and students were going to experience significant moral injury during the pandemic. Now, remember, this was written in February time, so it was speculative, but they said, we think this is going to happen to healthcare practitioners because of three things. Now, this is their wording, it's not my wording, but in this article, and we'll send you the link, it's a free download article if you wanted to read it, but they said that healthcare professionals were going to experience moral injury because they were going to need to think about how to allocate scant resources to what they described as equally needy patients. Because they were going to need to think about how to balance their own physical and healthcare needs with those of their patients. And because they would need to make decisions about how to align their duty of care towards patients with the duty towards their own family network. And when I read it, I was captured and I thought, social workers deal with those kinds of things all the time. We don't really even need a pandemic to be thinking about how do we allocate insufficient resources to people in equal need. We don't need a pandemic, but during the pandemic, when we also have the added layer of working at home, this is going to hit. And I started to think about it. I wrote a bit of a blog about it and I started to talk about it, and people have contacted me since, and I get 5-10 messages a day from people saying they're experiencing moral injury, and it's very common, I think, now. And it's things like where we're being asked to do something that we feel, I don't feel comfortable with that, or where we're not able to do something, like I was saying, I felt I can't help here, and it really, I think I suffered a moral injury in not being able to help people who were telling me about the horror of working in hospital social work on a COVID ward. You know, those sorts of things really challenging. And so we need to think about moral injury, and we need to think about the impact of moral injury and what it does for people and what happens. in many ways, it is similar with concepts that we're already familiar with. So things like compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, burnout. But you don't expect people at the early stages of their career to have those. You know, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, they're things we think happen after a few years. But students and newly qualified workers are experiencing moral injury on a daily basis. You know, I mean, if I give you a couple of examples that I've got permission to share, but a couple of examples. So a student who is working from home, homeschooling, children are there, trying to be observed by their practice educator on screen, in a call with a service user, child falls down, they feel like torn in all these different directions. What do? I want to go and help my child who's fallen down, but I'm also being directly observed. I've also got a service user on the line. I've got all these different things that we're juggling all at the same time. What about a newly qualified worker who talked to me about being at home after picking up her daughter at the end of the day? Her daughter was 6 years old or so. She's provided with a headset like the one that Prosper is wearing to provide confidentiality so that the people sitting around her can't hear what service users are saying, but they can hear what she's saying. And she has to ask very specific questions of service users that are sometimes quite traumatic questions. Like she might say, she works in a mental health team on the crisis line, and she might ask questions like, do you have a plan to take your own life? And she might ask, how many tablets have you taken? She might ask really difficult questions. She doesn't want her 6-year-old child to hear those questions. And what's happening there? What's that trauma that we're bringing into our homes? And it's very difficult. Thinking about a team manager who witnessed during a supervision session, and this could happen to a practice educator, but a supervision session's going on with a social worker, and the social worker's partner came in and started shouting and throwing things and screaming at the social worker. Domestic abuse occurring in front of the manager's eyes. These are examples of moral injury, and they're happening all of the time. People who develop moral injury are likely to experience negative thoughts about themselves or others. Feelings of shame, guilt, or disgust are common. We know it impacts on practice and morale. We know it's going to negatively impact on analysis and decision making. The Awareness Therapy Centre that is looking at this at the moment with the NHS says the symptoms of moral injury can manifest themselves in changes in sleep patterns, in significant or persistent changes in behaviour or habits, through mistakes, through isolation, through compulsive behaviour, and a weakened sense of empathy or compassion. If that's impacting on students, we need to know about it. You know, we've got to think about this. How do we deal with it? The good news, and there is good news about moral injury, is the good news is that there are things we can do about it, but we have to know about it, and we have to talk about it, and we have to explore it. Now, I've done a lot of research on moral injury since finding out about it in February. There's very little research, as I said, in social work. There's a couple of articles in American social work, but they're not about social workers. They're about service users. So, but taken from looking at what does the military say, what's the NHS say, and increasingly there's a lot going on in the NHS about moral injury at the moment. And these are the things that are said to help to mitigate the impact. Team working and a sense that you belong to a community of practice, almost your secure base attachment thing really to a team. A strong reflective culture, good quality, emotionally supportive, reflective supervision, the opportunity for in-depth reflection with a particular focus on feelings and emotions, education about the potential of moral injury and a permission to talk about it and share the depth and explore your injury with colleagues, and a clear recognition of the importance of your work and value being placed on it. Now, the good news is that's all stuff that we can do with students as practice educators. We can encourage reflection. We can provide good quality reflective supervision. We can educate students about the potential of moral injury, and we can talk to them about that and explore it and whether they're experiencing it. We can place value on what they're doing and make them feel like they are of value. I know students now are really struggling with that. They're being told, oh, you're a burden, we can't have you on the team at the moment, because they feel burdensome. They don't feel like they're being valued as co-professionals, and we need to really work on that. I think for students, we need to think about how can students feel more valued. I heard students the other day talking about they don't hear anything from their university about what they should do in lockdown, and they're feeling like the lost generation and the invisible generation. And I just think it matters. We need to talk to students about it. The Awareness Centre says, though, and that more good news, long-term negative consequences of morally injurious events are not inevitable. This isn't a long-term consequence. We can support people through this. Although exact data is not available at the moment, it's likely that most healthcare workers who experience morally injurious events will not have long-term negative outcomes. Now, I would replace that with social workers, but they're working with healthcare workers. In fact, they say after potentially morally injurious experiences, some even eventually develop a redefined meaning in life, and with time and support begin to incorporate the experience into growth or into helping others. Using our values and ethics can help us to find that redefined aspect after difficult situations. And a piece of work that I found really helpful, and I wanted to guide you towards reading, and I said we'll send you links to these afterwards, but this is something, it's black and white because my printer's black and white, it's blue online. It's called The Courage to be Kind, reflecting on the role of kindness in the healthcare response to COVID-19. It's a new thing come out of Scotland. I'd advise reading it. It's a really easy read. I'd advise getting students to read it. But in there, this is what it says. The best support that we can offer right now is honest, open conversations so that people feel heard and validated in their experience. That is what will help to get them through. Once we're through it, there's going to be different work to do. Whenever I've spoken about moral injury, there have always been people in the audience who have breathed a huge sigh of relief because there's a name for the way we're feeling. It's no different now. We really need to find ways to talk about how we're feeling, both the good and the bad, so that we can bear it. And the important sentence here, it's silence that will do the harm, not talking. So we need to talk about this. We need to think about moral injury, and likewise, we need to talk about inequality and what's going on because of moral injury. We need to think about white silence in Black Lives Matter. Silence does the harm, not the talking. So those in power, you know, politicians and even celebrities at the start were saying we're all in the same boat. You know we are not all in the same boat. We might be all facing the same wave. We're not all in the same boat. Some people are in an armour tanked super boat, and some people are in a dinghy with a hole in it. You know, even now, you know, they've been calling COVID the great leveller. You know, even this week, Boris Johnson, when he was talking about getting with a fair wind in our sails, he's still talking about this flipping boat. And we're not all in the same boat. You know, we know, don't we? Economists have for a long time been predicting a COVID-19 recession, crisis of inequality. Social workers know that there's been a crisis of inequality for many years, but the pandemic's increased that. You know, and there's some statistics there that demonstrate that. All the references will be on the slides, but we know there is a crisis of inequality. The United Nations at the start, early stages of the pandemic, talked about the impact, the differential impact of COVID in terms of gender. And this was a paragraph that I really liked, where they were talking about gender inequality. And they said, a pandemic amplifies and heightens all existing inequalities. Gender inequality plagued society long before COVID-19, but it doesn't have to define our response to it. Some people will argue that to focus on gender inequality now is wrong. Others will say we can wait until after the crisis, but it's a false choice. It's a mistake to see these things as wholly separate. Instead, the pandemic, you know well, of gender inequality is accelerating the one that you already live with. Sorry, the pandemic we know well, COVID, is accelerating the gender inequality pandemic. And that's the same for race. The Black Lives Matter campaign. Early in the pandemic, George Floyd's murder had a really significant impact on society. And that Black Lives Matter campaign really does matter. And we need to be talking to students about this. You know, I want to take you back to that sentence. It's silence that will do the harm, not talking. And I want to encourage all of you to think about white silence. And it matters. We need to talk about this stuff. It relates to our values and ethics. And I found these two quotations online around silence, and they're so important in terms of values and ethics of social workers. Social workers need to speak up. We need to talk about inequality. It's vital because silence kills. This quote, silence kills the soul. It diminishes its possibilities to rise and fly and explore. Silence withers what makes you human. The soul shrinks until it's nothing. And another one I think relates a lot to how we have to be socially distanced. Distance doesn't separate people. Silence does. This matters. We need to talk about it. We know that coronavirus deepens inequality, and we know that inequality worsens the spread of coronavirus. We know that crisis amplifies inequality, and we know that inequality is a social work crisis. This stuff matters, and we need to talk about it. We need to amplify our voices as social workers, and we need to support students to do that. This is the values and ethics of social work, the values and ethics of practice education, and all of this matters. And I said to you that it was World Social Work Day that I went into shielding myself. And it's ironic, really, isn't it? Because World Social Work Day was all about promoting the importance of human relationships. The poster had us shaking hands with one another, but social work responded to the pandemic even before World Social Work Day. So the poster was changed from handshaking to a socially distanced poster. My daughter lives in China. My eldest daughter lives in China. So for me, the virus has been a part of our lives for a bit longer, because she was talking about the impact on her living in China much before it hit us here. And she sent me what I've put on a screenshot there. I was so proud that social workers reached out to my daughter as an expat living in China to say, here is how we can help you during the pandemic. Social workers were reaching out all over the world and are still reaching out all over the world. And I want to encourage you to ask students that are coming on placement with you to revisit the international context of social work, to look at how we globally connect as we socially distance. So you know the international definition of social work, and I'm not going to read it out to you because of time, but it's there on screen, and I want you to encourage your students to revisit that. If you're a social worker in England, the PCF Domain 1 and Domain 9 both link into global social work. So think about this, but also I want you to think about this as a social work definition. It's Ruth Allen's definition of social work from 2018, and I think it's so fitting for right now. So Ruth Allen, Chief Exec of Basworth, says social work is about life. It's about treasuring humanity. It's about building connections, sharing, promoting fairness. It's about creativity, care, and love. It's about being there to help people overcome obstacles and oppression that holds them back. For people using our services, a social worker should be someone to trust and believe in, someone who helps you to believe in yourself. Sometimes we must hold boundaries, protect rights, advocate, and challenge. And we're always in the midst of the messy stuff, finding ways forwards. Well, we're right in the midst of the messy stuff right now, aren't we? And we need to find ways forward. I want to encourage you to read. If you can't read because of time, I get it, time to, I haven't got enough time. These are easy reads. Encourage your students to read them. Encourage your students to talk to you about these. There's 2 documents. This is the first one. They're both freely available. You can see, look, I've downloaded them and they're full of little post-it notes because I've found them so helpful. They're easy reads. They're from the International Federation of Social Workers. To the top of the cliff, how COVID has changed, how social work has changed with COVID-19. And that document is a really easy read, but it takes you through sections. It starts with the beginning of the pandemic and how social workers in China responded. It goes to social workers all over the world adapting to the pandemic. It goes to how we need to reinvent social work in light of the pandemic. And then it goes to looking for finding ways forward. In the messy stuff, how do we find our ways forward? And it talks about reclaiming the very foundations of social work, the values and ethics. Now, remember, I referred earlier to Kaplan and the 3 stages of crisis. This document takes you through the 3 stages of crisis for social work. I'd encourage you to look at it. Now, I thought, because I'm a visual thinker, and I was thinking about why have they used a cliff? I thought it was because COVID had taken us to the top of the cliff and we nearly fell off. That's what I thought, but that's not why they chose it. This is why it's about a cliff. And I love it. I love the image of this. They say, for social work today, there is an opportunity to move from the recently imposed role of just being there to pick up the debris at the bottom of the cliff, just being completely reactive and responsive, to its original role of building fences at the top of the cliff, preventing disaster through work supporting communities to support themselves. It's about reclaiming what social work is about: relationships, values, ethics. And the other document, back to Prospera's bottle of water. And honestly, Prospera hadn't seen it, but back to the bottle of water is the front page of the International Federation of Social Workers guidance on ethics in the pandemic has got water on the front. So it's basically values and ethics are about water and the tap. And I'm going to just give you a quote from Sarah Banks, who's written in the introduction to this new ethical guidance. She writes, social workers, like all of you, social workers have been working tirelessly during the COVID-19 pandemic, not just to deliver much needed social services, but also to do this as respectfully, compassionately, and fairly as possible. Practicing during pandemic and crisis conditions is extremely challenging. It unsettles old priorities and requires a reassessment of what might be ethically right in new circumstances. At times when social workers are at their most stressed and isolated, and when fast responses are expected, the importance of slow, careful, ethical deliberation is never greater. This guide draws on social workers' accounts of their real-life ethical challenges and responses to offer some pointers for social workers to consider. We hope that social workers will find the time to read it, to reflect on the issues raised, and to contribute new ideas and recommendations as circumstances and practices evolve. And I would say to you, this is an excellent document for you to read or to get students to read. The International Federation in that document highlights the key challenges all over the world. And I'm going to read these out to you now. And you said at the beginning, I'm from Northern Ireland, I'm from Hartlepool, I'm from Coventry. And I'm going to tell you now that these are all over the world, but these are in Hartlepool, these are in Northern Ireland, these are in Coventry. You might as well have written this about my social work. It's totally relevant to every single social worker. The ethical challenges we face at the moment are people without access to technology or without the skills to use it might lose contact, might be unable to access services. There are threats to privacy from home-based ICT systems which might not be reliable or secure. We have difficulties in ensuring privacy and confidentiality when conversations might be overheard by other members of the households of either service users or social workers. We've got difficulties in making fair assessments of service users' needs and living conditions without being able to move freely through a house or without being able to see and sense non-verbal gestures. There's difficulties in creating empathy and building trusting relationships, especially with people who are accessing services for the first time, so you may never have physically met them. There are problems in maintaining boundaries between personal and professional life, as service users might regard the use of ICT as a more informal means of communication, particularly if a social worker is working from home. And where face-to-face meetings do occur, the use of face masks and other PPE and physical distancing can inhibit relationships and can be off-putting or even frightening for service users at stressful times in their lives. And that document offers guidance on how to deal with that and is really helpful for us and for students. Back to the top of the cliff document. And whilst at the moment we've got all of this really rich ethical guidance coming to us as social workers, Truell and Crompton say this. They say, as the pandemic evolves and as it then ends, there's a real risk that we'll return to the status quo, to the gap between rich and poor, to a reliance on philanthropy and charity, rather than recognising assets within the global community, which are the foundations of change. For many years, the social work profession has advanced a learning model. Remember, we're practice educators. We use that learning model that collaborates across national borders. Now is a crucial time for the world to establish new global ethical foundations which centre around solidarity, equality, and recognising everyone's diverse strengths, rights, and responsibilities. And so World Social Work Day this year has a new theme, the theme Ubuntu. It's from the Africa region, but relevant for everybody. And it's all about Indigenous populations and communities and equal opportunities and anti-oppressive practice. It's I am because we are. There's nothing more relevant for us as practice educators. I am because students are. I learn because students give to me. It's that whole thing about what are we going to do on World Social Work Day this year as practice educators and as students, and how are we going to come together? And so I hope that these webinars that we're going to do during January, February and March will help us to work towards that Ubuntu, and that will bring us together. Now, the poster for World Social Work Day next year has been translated into many languages, and one of the languages it's been translated into is Chinese. I've told you about my daughter living in China, and this is the poster. It's done by the Hong Kong Association of Social Workers in Traditional Chinese. And just to kind of start to draw things to a conclusion so that we have a few moments left for questions at the end of the webinar, I am reliably told by my daughter that in Chinese, in traditional Chinese, the word crisis loosely translates as opportunity riding on a dangerous wind. And that's what we've got right now. This crisis has brought to us an opportunity. It's riding on a very dangerous wind, but it's opportunity. And the Courage to Be Kind document that I showed you earlier, whilst it's written about the healthcare response, there's so much in there that we can take about social work. And this talks all about opportunity. It says there's a huge amount of opportunity for us to deliver relational services. During the pandemic, we've taken away performance management and micromanagement, and we've fostered creativity and working together. And there's been a real cohesion between previous turfdoms. We need to celebrate the really good stuff that's happened, and we need to build a better society. And the key thing from that document says it's important right now to all the time, but it's important to be kind to staff. Otherwise, they won't have the reserves to bring that into their work and their interactions. If you have staff that are being looked after, this will permeate into how they are with patients. If we are looked after, that will permeate into how we are with students. If students are looked after, it will permeate into our profession. We need to be kind. We need to be kind to one another. We need to be kind to students. We need to be kind to the profession. We need to be kind to everyone. But most of all, I want you to be kind to yourself. Kindness matters now more than it's ever mattered before. Kindness really matters. Now, in that group of 5 students that I worked with across the summer, I failed one of those students, and I was reflecting on kindness and thinking, I'm sure that student doesn't think I was kind, but there's a difference. And I came across this on the internet, and I think it's a really nice way of what I want to summarize up at the end of the session, because it leads us into our values and ethics and kindness. It's about the difference between being nice and being kind. Being nice is never wanting to rock the boat. Being kind is being willing to make waves. Being nice is being most concerned with not upsetting someone. Being kind is being most concerned with doing what's right. Being nice is being afraid to speak up when you witness unkind behaviour. Being kind is being willing to speak up and take a stand. Being nice is being worried about being liked. But being kind is being worried about being kind. And that's what we need to do. That's what's the most important thing about our values and ethics, to me, at the very heart of our values. We started off this session by saying the PEPs say that values sit at the heart of social work and at the heart of the practice educator professional standards. And I would say that at the heart of our values is the need to be kind to one another and to connect. And at the moment, whilst we have to be physically distanced from one another, we can remain socially connected in new and different ways. And we hope that you will get something from this series of webinars that we've put together, and the webinars that we can direct you to about the very practical, how do I do a direct observation? How do I develop an induction? And we can direct you to some of those. And we hope that what we're able to offer to you over the next couple of months will help and will be kind and will help us to think about values and ethics, and will help us to think about being practice educators in this new way of working. So our next session will be led by Prospera, and I will be in the chat supporting Prospera in the way that Prospera has been supporting the session today. But Prospera will be leading the next session on anti-oppressive practice education, contemporary barriers and enablers. I know lots of you have already registered for that, but Omar is going to put the link in again. If you're not registered, you can register to attend that session now. The slides that we send to you will have the references on today, as you'll see there. So Omar will do some magic with those and email them round to you. And I'm also going to email you the 2 share grids that I showed you earlier, and the links for the documents, the IFSW documents and the Courage to be Kind documents are also in the slides, but we'll send you those links as well. So I know we've had a few questions, and I'm sorry we haven't had more time for questions, but we have just about 10 minutes left of the session. So if you do have questions that you've not posed yet, if you want to pop them into the Q&A, I think Omar will tell me if there are some questions. Now, there might be huge questions that I can't answer right here and right now. But what I will also try and do is, after the webinar, I'll read the questions and I'll look at if I can send any answers or anything through. We'll send those through on a follow-up email as well to make sure that we can answer as many of them as possible. But Omar, are there any questions that maybe either Prospera could answer or that I could answer? Or
we've only had one more question come through. That's just asking how long Prospera's session is going to be. And all sessions will be 2 hours. So it'll be 12 p.m. till 2 p.m.
Yeah, they'll all be the same. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Someone else is asking whether the links that were put in the chat will be emailed out too. And I'm planning to do a whole kind of follow-up email, Siobhan, with the grids as well. So I'll just put that together and I'll send that out. So yeah, every single link that I've been putting in the chat will be sent out in a follow-up email as well.
Okay, great. So that's helpful. Okay, and yep, you can process all of the sessions. They'll all be from 12 till 2, but they'll all be, we thought that this would be the best time of the day because it's during a working day, but it's also across your lunch. So you can sit and have your lunch while you're joining in with us. So that's all good. I think I just saw a question saying, can I share the slides? I'm happy for the slides to be shared if you feel you want to use them with students or whatever. But all I would do is I would say, please do attribute them, because, you know, I spend hours on preparing the slides and putting the session to get together today. And I know Prospera will spend hours on hers. And I have seen some slides pop up where people have been passing them off as, and I know that they're my slides because my daughter draws the images to go on them, and that's the images on the slides, and I think that's my slide. So we do spend hours on these, and I want to be as kind as possible and say, please do feel free to use it, but please also be kind in return and recognize the work that was put in and attribute them to where they came from. That's important. Are there any other questions whilst we've still got a few minutes, or I don't know if there's anything people would like to say into the chat at all? I do know there's quite a few people asking for, I'd really like to know about doing a direct observation. When we chatted to NOPT, we didn't want to repeat sessions that we'd already done. We wanted to do something bespoke, and that's why we've done these 3. But there is a webinar just like this, but that is just specifically about how to do a direct observation and how to assess students and how to give feedback via a screen. And so we will give you those links into those very specific things. So I'm seeing people are saying thank you and goodbye now, and that's great. We've finished with a couple of minutes to go, so if you're needing to get off, that's great. Prospera, is there anything you wanted to say? I'm conscious because I didn't know how long it was going to take. I just powered on through, and but I know you were involved in the chat, so that was great. But is there anything you want to say?
Yeah, just to say quickly that obviously because of the pandemic and the current lockdown, it appears that we have some UK-based students who live in Dubai. And so what I was going to just add was that I've been approached to start thinking about, if these students can't come back to the UK to do those placements, would I do the practice education from this end, which has been absolutely useful. Now, what was interesting was I said, well, of course I can, but it will be similar to what you would do from there. It would be virtual, you know. So it's just getting people to think about some of the opportunities. I know I use opportunities loosely that this has provided. It just means that in trying to keep these students safe, they've said, look, if you can find yourself a placement in Dubai, we will find somebody to supervise that and work with you as a practice educator. So it has provided that potentially for universities that didn't ever think they would do international placements, yeah, but they're now having to think about how they might facilitate that for their international students who are based abroad. So I just thought I'd run that by you, but it's 2 students so far, which was really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, it's that opportunity riding on a dangerous wind, isn't it?
That's right.
And I think we're becoming more of a global profession, and global placement opportunities will be opened up. I think that'd be amazing. And to be honest, your practice educator doing it virtually doesn't have to be in that same country even, you know, so yeah, absolutely, it'd be brilliant. So yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you very much, Omar. I know Omar starts placement on Monday, don't you? And so involvement in these sessions and helping us out with these sessions is going to be great evidence for you, Omar. So thank you so much for joining us and helping with the sessions. You're so skilled now at getting the tech going with this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Siobhan, please.
Absolutely, Jill. Yes.
Yeah, so just from NOPT, a huge thank you to you, Siobhan, and Prospera, and I saw Joe for a little while too. Thank you so much for doing them. I'm sure everybody's had a fantastic time listening. Unfortunately, I didn't get into the chat. I seem to have some problems doing that. Obviously, either I don't know what I'm doing or I've not done it, or something went wrong there. But just thank you. It's been absolutely, I also wanted to really listen, so I feel I've not quite involved myself in the way I should have. But anyway, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thank you, Jill. I'm really looking forward to the next one because I always learn so much from Prospera, and I can sit and engage in the chat and just listen to the to Prospera's work, which is always so fabulous. So thank you ever so much. So thank you for joining. If we were in a NOPT conference, say if you do come together, Jill, in Sheffield, and I know we've got the date in our diary as well, so but if we were all together in a room, I wouldn't feel the need to wave at you as you were leaving. I've never waved when leaving a conference, but for some reason nowadays I cannot leave a virtual session without waving. Something, I'm sorry, it's an affliction I now have, but anyway, I shall wave as we close the session. But thank you ever so much for attending, and I hope people got something from it. Thank you ever so much.
Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.